Welcome everybody. I'm Melissa Jones with BARHII. I think I've met many of you before, but we're thrilled to have you here today because we have been working on housing work very intently over the last, particularly affordability issues over the last 2 years. And this is really the launch of a whole new phase of that work. And so folks on the phone, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You can see me waving. Yes, okay. I suppose it's fine if you can't see me waving. I'm not in my Warriors clothes anyways. Yes, but I'm not in like half price happy hour Warriors clothes yet. So BARHII about 3.5, 4 years ago hosted a retreat of the public health departments in the Bay Area. I think most of you know we're the coalition of the public health departments focused on the issues that are impacting health that are separate and unique from healthcare, the living conditions that impact how healthy we are. And 3.5, 4 years ago, we hosted a retreat of the health departments to hear what issues were most pressing, both for public health clients and for public health at large. And what everybody said at the time were issues of housing affordability. And you remember 3.5, 4 years ago, there were very clearly community groups talking about housing affordability and a lot of elected officials trying to figure out if the issues around affordability were affecting a very narrow segment and a group of people that needed a very particular intervention, or if it was a much broader issue, right? That conversation has really shifted over the last 3 or 4 years. People are very clear that housing affordability is a broad-based issue. And we tried to do a couple of pieces of research to really help make what we had been hearing from community clearer to many different constituencies in the Bay Area who just for whatever reason hadn't seen it yet. And so we did the housing displacement brief that many of you have seen. It showed using using research from UC Berkeley that we'll talk more about later, that nearly 50% of the census tracts in the Bay Area are impacted by escalating or displacement or very high risk of displacement, and that for different income groups, the level of housing cost burden is at a point that is so high that it really starts to threaten health. It starts to impact things like how much people can spend on healthy food and availability for basic medical care. So we found that people who were not housing cost burdened, who were living in housing they could afford, were spending 1/3 more on healthy food and 5 times more managing whatever medical condition, which means it's the difference in everybody else was having to make really tough choices around their budget that were to preserve housing, which I think we would all argue is one of the fundamentals for health. But it meant that either they were waiting for an income tax check to do all of the healthcare that they needed, because that's the only time that came back, and I think many of you know that didn't come back to people in the same way this year, or really foregoing the care until it was at a point that we've really hoped people wouldn't wait for, right? Which was the point of really getting to having broader access to healthcare. And for many people, the cost of housing was squeezing in on that broader piece of healthcare. We have a basic contention. It's really based on a lot of research about health and about living conditions, that we should all have housing that's affordable, stable, and healthy for all of us, and that it should be healthy now. And so some of the where housing is affordable is actually not that healthy, the quality of the housing. And we have some of those issues that we want to talk about over the course of this series. And that it should be healthy and resilient and ready for our next wave of whatever disasters we see around earthquakes and fires, etc. And so we're really glad to have you all here today because there's a whole series of policy work we've been doing. And, you know, I'm a public administrator by training. I spent a fair amount of time in city government, and I really believe that far more important than intent is our impact in the way that policies implement, and that happens through public administration and through us in partnership. And so I will share that about us, but we'd love to give you all an opportunity to know who's in the room. I know we have a little more than 10 people also on the phone. So we'll start here, and then we'll go this way.
And just literally name and jurisdiction.
Yep. Nora Malin Brand with Health Services in Sonoma County.
Rita Polson versus Sonoma County. Anna Cash, Urban Displacement Project, UC Berkeley.
Great, and just a little bit louder, everybody.
So, Teddy Delaga, Santa Clara County Public.
Tina Rodovan, Santa Clara County Public Health.
Christine Wu, Solana County Public Health.
Nelson out.
Yeah. You probably go to chat.
Hi, if you're on the phone, please mute yourself.
Solange Gould, California Department of Public Health.
Tammy Lee, Alameda County Public Health Department. Emily Carroll,
Jamie Smith, Contra Costa Housing and Public Services.
Matt Wolf, Department of Public Health.
Erin Pierce, San Francisco Department of Public Health.
Kara Spaz, Marin County Health and Human Services. Tram Nguyen, Alameda County Public Health.
Sarah Cerveza, San Francisco Department of Public Health.
Hello, Rachel Launders, County Planning Office of Sustainability.
Okay.
Michael Chan, Contra Costa County Health Department.
Okay, thank you. And to the telephone.
And also, we just had someone walk in.
Wilhelmina Park Garcia.
Hi, Wilhelmina.
And to the telephone.
Hi, this is Belen Seara from Mateo County Health.
Rohan Nalakrishna from Contra Costa Health Services.
This is Denise from the County of San Mateo Office of Sustainability.
And then we've got a few chat people from people who are listening but haven't actually talked. We have Eugene Dura from Solano County, Freddie Ford from Solano County, and Aaron and Jennifer from Napa.
Great, thank you. And that was Melanie's voice there. So thank you all. Now my pleasure to introduce. Oh, yes.
Hi, it's Leslie Zeitler from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity.
Oh, hi,
Hi,
Leslie.
Leslie.
Thank you.
Hi.
So it is now my pleasure to introduce BARHII's housing guru.
Thanks,
I say
Melissa.
that, not kidding. Will has done so much work that has really brought that housing work to life in conjunction with the Built Environment Committee. His two co-chairs are here in blue, one in the back in the middle and one in the other side in the back in the middle. And so the brief that you see there was really crafted from a base and body of work that Will had developed. And he's been leading our work with community organizing and other partners to really think about the range of solutions we need on housing. And he has designed this whole cohort for you. So thank you, Will.
And to do a not false modesty part of that too, like that brief also comes out of the work of maternal and child health directors across the region. It's mostly their thinking, particularly around the health impacts and what we can do about them. And then also just to say, like, this program comes out of the Built Environment Committee, which has worked for many, many years at BARHII, thinking about the intersection of our built environments and how they impact our health. And then over the last year or so has really gotten particularly focused on housing habitability, how we keep people in, how we make sure that people can live in homes that actually support their health. So thank you also, Built Environment Committee. So I'm going to give you just like a 5-minute overview of this program, and then we're going to dive into content for today. So, I mean, you've all, I think, seen probably already the like little one-pager that was getting mailed around. This was what we used as a recruitment tool. And it has on it, or actually, I guess I took them off, but our goals for this are really to help build a cohort of leaders on this issue across the region, right? Like we've been working on this a lot as BARHII staff and our policy committee, and I think our assessment is we actually really need people across the region who have the skills, knowledge, expertise, and relationships to address housing. And we have that in a lot of your counties, and also I've heard in a lot of your counties, we need some support. We need some extra, we need those skills, knowledge, and relationships. So it's designed to help support that. The other thing about that is that we know we can't do it on our own, right? Like this isn't necessarily public health's main lane. It's the lane of some of our other sister agencies in housing and planning and development and sustainability. So the intent of this series is really to train public health staff and then bring in 3 months some of our folks from sister agencies in housing, planning, and sustainability. We've also opened up that invitation early to folks that want to kind of like beef up their housing knowledge. So I heard, for instance, the city of Richmond, I heard some folks from the sustainability department, and other parts of their city or county government. So it's really going to be, the intent is to build kind of cross-departmental teams. The last thing I would say is just like, part of the intent is really to draw down new revenue for housing, right? There's actually like this last year and then this coming year have been giant years for housing policy and housing funding in California. And we want to make sure we get some of that money and orient it towards health equity and making sure that it's really supporting the residents of our counties that need it. And so part of the intent of this is also designed around how do we make sure we're identifying those opportunities and then bringing them home and drawing down those revenues in our jurisdictions. So the way that this is going to work is, again, we have 3 sessions. So this month, there's another one actually next week, and then one more in July, that are the core training for public health staff and other folks that they are going to be, so today is really like an overview of housing conditions in the Bay Area. What are some of the root causes of the problems that we find ourselves in, and what are some of the solutions? And we have some excellent trainers. So Anna Cash from the Urban Displacement Project at BARHII, and then Ophelia just stepped into the room. Ophelia, do you want to announce yourself?
Yes.
Or introduce yourself?
Yes, and I'll turn around. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ophelia. I'm with Yuga out of East Palo Alto, and I'll say a little more about that. But
great. So we have 2 like super amazing experts who will guide us through today. Next session is really going to be around like how housing is actually developed. It's going to be really nerdy. We're going to dive into like what are the steps that go into it, and also what are some of the finances. This is something I called a bunch of the directors around the region, and this was like that was their top priority for you all to understand, or for us all to understand, is like literally how's housing developed. So that's going to be next session. We'll have one more session that I'm keeping a little bit flexible at this point, based on kind of like what bubbles up in these first 2 sessions. And then we're really going to start doing some recruitment. We'll actually start recruitment now-ish, and there are already some folks from our sister agencies that are really interested and excited about this project, but we'll fold them in then in August. And then from there on out, start working on projects together. The one other thing I would say is there's kind of like a parallel structure, which is there's like time-sensitive things that are coming up that we think are real opportunities that we'll be having as like implementation workshops that go along with it. So for instance, a little bit later, I'll talk about a partnership we're doing with BARHII, which is around energy efficiency and public health and housing habitability. And there's, in any case, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But there'll be things like that also throughout the year that you're welcome to come to. They're not, you don't need to come to, and we'll also do broader outreach in your jurisdictions to try to get the right people in the room to actually move on those opportunities. I think that those are the main things in terms of the arc of the program. The last thing I wanted to mention is we are in kind of, I would say, like a growing moment, both at BARHII and in the broader world about technology. We're trying to do this as much in person as possible to like actually build relationships, because that's one of the intents of this. And there will be times when we're like, we actually need you to be in person, especially when we start folding in our sister agencies, because we want to build those relationships face to face. That said, we also have 10 people on the phone. We're going to do small groups later. And we're going to do an experiment, and maybe messy, to have, if in your jurisdiction, there's people that are on the phone who are not here physically, we need someone from your jurisdiction to download Zoom on your phone or on your laptop. And then we're going to try to do breakout groups where we fold in our virtual members as well. So who knows in their jurisdiction that there's someone on the phone who's not here? So Contra Costa, Solano, San Mateo. Are we missing anybody? Napa? Although Napa is entirely phone, right? Anyone from Napa in the room? Great. Okay, so we're going to pass out a sign-in sheet. Please also include your phone number on the sign-in sheet, and that'll allow Melanie to assign you to the correct breakout group. And please, someone in each jurisdiction who is here, download Zoom. Okay? I think bathrooms over there, wireless is written on the back thing. Any questions before we dive into content?
Where is the sign-in sheet right now? Okay.
Oh, I signed in.
Okay.
Thank you.
What about you, Ophelia?
Okay, yeah.
I didn't yet.
Oh, you need to sign in. Great. Okay. Okay. Great. So then we're going to dive in. And I just wanted to return to that basic contention that Melissa put out, which is that we should all have housing that's affordable to us, that's stable, and that's healthy now and healthy also in case of whatever happens in California, because things are increasingly happening in California. And then we wanted to kind of like start breaking those things down. In a second, I'm going to ask Anna to come up and bring her expertise to that as well. But I wanted to start off with just like, what's affordable housing? And also this is going to be very interactive. I'm sorry, so you're going to have to participate. So what's affordable housing? What do you think about when you hear affordable housing? Yeah,
There's usually like a threshold of the percentage of your income that should go towards your housing.
Yeah, and what's that percentage usually?
40, 30%.
Yeah, we usually talk about 30 as like over 30 is cost burdens, and over 50 is usually considered like extremely cost burdens. And especially for those of us, for people who are at the like lower end of an income scale, 30% starts looking like a lot of money, right? So that what that means is it's like what we consider affordable depends on how much money you make, right? So like as just like a basic example, my ex-roommate and I, we used to pay pretty much the exact same amount of rent. I made a little bit more money than he did, so our apartment for me was affordable, for him it wasn't, right? And that looks really different in different parts of our region. So in San Mateo, for instance, like we usually benchmark affordability based on median family income. So like approximately what is a family income for the median family in a county. And that varies a lot. So like in San Mateo, where I used to work, that was $103,000. In Alameda County, it's $10,000 less. So affordability looks different for different people in different places, right? The tricky thing with talking about affordable housing is it's both used to talk about like, can we literally afford our homes? And then also, it's also shorthand for like subsidized housing, right? So like, is the government playing a role in helping subsidize your housing? And as Anna will talk about in a second, there's actually a lot of subsidies in housing that we don't usually think about. But by and large, when we talk about subsidized housing, it's like housing that the price is set and people usually pay about 30% of their income. So I guess just like one last thing to mention is like how important that is for health. We know that people who can comfortably afford their housing spend 5 times more on medical care, more on childcare, a third more on healthy food, right? So like all the things that we're working to guarantee as public health or make sure that people have access to, if they don't have healthy housing, we know that those things, they're going to have really difficult times accessing them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Okay, so
if you can stand like in this little digital pocket.
Great. How am I doing? Good. So, and another thing I would add to the affordable housing piece is there's one approach called residual income, which maybe some of you have heard of, that sort of looks at what's left as a starting point. And so I love what you were talking about, and I think that's a really interesting framework as well. So we also want to think about not just what is affordable housing, but what is stable housing and what is healthy and resilient housing. So in terms of housing stability, I'd love to just hear from folks in the room what housing stability looks like to you. What is sort of an example of stable housing? It doesn't have to be a type of housing, but just what characterizes stable. So you've got a formal legal relationship to the housing.
Stable housing is you move if you want to.
Yes.
Because you're going to.
Yes. So you're staying in place by choice, you're moving by choice.
Rent control.
Rent control. You aren't being subject to unexpected rent hikes. Yeah. Anybody else?
You have maintenance, your property owners.
Yeah, you've got healthy housing quality. And what are some of the kind of impacts of stable housing for households, families, individuals? Maybe from the public health perspective.
Yeah, I want to hear like people like your clients or residents and folks that you work with, like what do you see?
Yeah.
Impact in terms of their health.
Yeah.
It's a reduction of stress.
Mhm.
When you have stable housing, you have an address where you can get mail to stay on top of them.
Yeah.
You're more likely to stay with your medical home.
Mhm.
It means better health for your family, yourself and your family.
Maintaining your community and social fabric. If you're stable, you have access to your longtime place of worship, neighbors, people that you go to when you need to because your kids are sick, an egg, whatever. Those things that make us feel safe and supported and resilient during hard times.
Yeah, and I'd add schools and jobs as well, and sometimes with displacement comes longer and more costly commutes, which have their own public health impact. Anybody else?
From the phone, we have people noting that it exacerbates mental health systems and can affect regular school attendance for children.
Great. I think that's a wonderful collective definition. Do you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. So we also today want to come from the stability framework, but also a framework of resiliency and thinking about climate stressors, climate hazards, natural disasters, and who's sort of, what kind of housing is most resilient in the face of these climate pressures. So I also want to ask, what is healthy and resilient housing look like? And maybe actually starting from the sort of healthy housing perspective, does anyone in here do home visits, seeing challenges with lead or asthma? Yeah, go ahead.
So healthy housing, in terms of the impact of climate change, housing that is resilient to high heat, lack of conducive conditions for mold, for insects, for rodents, particulate matter infiltration, things like that.
Yeah, and as you said, that can have a lot to do with how properties are being maintained, but it can also have to do with sort of where your housing is located and how vulnerable it is to to issues like nuisance flooding in the first place, right?
I don't know where it falls, but I think about overcrowding a lot. Especially in the east part of Contra Costa, we have lots of many families in one house.
Yeah.
But I don't know kind of where that falls in here.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but I think that certainly there are health challenges that come with overcrowding that sort of need to be recognized as, I'm going to argue that they kind of need to be recognized as its own sort of housing condition or housing type, and we kind of need to look it in the face more as such. But I think in terms of thinking about healthy housing, overcrowding is a major challenge.
Yeah, and I was going to say that, yeah, I'm a lead inspector, so
Okay.
I go to the homes
Yeah.
and do inspections, and that's really the problem I see. Like it could be a 3-4 bedroom flat, and each bedroom has family, so it's overcrowding and the chaos that comes with that. And you see that kids don't even have a place to do their homework. They're like off steps trying to do their homework. They don't have their own room.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another relationship between affordability and health is a lot of families don't use their heat in the winter because they can't afford to, so they're cold. And commercially, they don't use their air conditioning in the summer because they can't afford to. So.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah.
Across the state, we're seeing a convergence of insecurity around housing, water, energy, and food. All converging in the housing space.
Yeah.
So just thinking about all the things that come into the house, the various things that we need to stay healthy, not just in the structure of the house, but the ability to warm it or cool it, to have water when it comes out of the tap that's healthy, to have food in the fridge, a fridge that works.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thinking about interconnections too with the affordability piece Will was just talking about, I think when we think about resilient housing, it's not resilient if you can't move back in after a natural disaster because there's rent gouging happening in the region or because your landlord needs to move back in or move a family member back in, right? So I think these interrelationships are also super important to pay attention to.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think like maybe 5 years ago or something, we were talking in the Built Environment Committee about resilient housing, and I think like it resonated with some people and it didn't with others. And I think like increasingly, like just like thinking about the North Bay fires, and I'm like, want people from Napa and Sonoma and Solano to bring in experiences in the room, but it's like increasingly like what we heard in an assessment after the North Bay fires talking to the health departments is like people could not move back to their homes. Either because they got burned or because their landlords moved back in to property that they had as rental property. So I think like what felt like abstract to some people is increasingly like it is here, it is now, and so that's part of why we're like building it into this program.
Right, and if it's affordable because it's in a zone that we know is at risk, also how resilient is that housing, and what does it mean to be affordable? Great. Okay, I think let's transition to the presentation. Great. Is there any way to minimize this? I'm worried that all the numbers are gonna get lost.
Yeah, we'll work on it.
Great. Okay. So just to introduce myself again, I'm Anna Cash, Associate Director of the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley. And we are a research and action center that does research on displacement and gentrification. So better understanding the nature of those phenomena and where they're taking place, and also the consequences of gentrification and displacement on households and on the region, and also thinking about potential ways of addressing those challenges. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call tenure diversity. So thinking about the many, many ways that people are living and the many different kinds of housing that exist, so that we can sort of take a more sober look at what all of these different housing types are and the different kinds of vulnerabilities they have when we think both about stability and also about health and resiliency. Great. So first, just to define displacement, I actually think our friend in the back there did a really great job of just displacement. We see it as, we sort of define it with a pretty broad tent of displacement occurs when any household is forced to move for reasons beyond its control. So sometimes you'll hear people define displacement as eviction, but we see it much more broadly as, rent increases and untenable housing conditions that force you to move. We can actually go to the next page. And here, some interesting things to introduce, but in this literature review, we did a literature review on gentrification, displacement, and the role of public investment, and sort of divide up different causes of displacement into direct or physical causes, indirect or economic causes, and then exclusionary displacement, which is when you can't move into a neighborhood of choice. And within that, looking at forced versus responsive displacement. And I think there's some haziness between forced and responsive, but just to give a sense, kind of a forced direct displacement would be a formal eviction, for example, whereas a responsive direct displacement, that's kind of physical responsive displacement, might be when the housing conditions become so untenable that families feel that they have to move. An economic forced move might be foreclosure, or a responsive might be a rent increase. It's sort of a de facto eviction in a lot of cases, so we could call it responsive. And then in terms of exclusionary displacement, again, when families can't move into neighborhoods or housing of choice, in terms of forced exclusion, there's Section 8 discrimination when a family has a voucher and landlords are unwilling to accept that, so they literally can't access that housing. And then responsive exclusionary displacement is just kind of an overall lack of affordable housing in the area, so you're unable to move into that. And Melissa already teed up some of our work in terms of gentrification and displacement mapping in the Bay Area, which is something that we're now replicating in other places around the country. And I'll let you kind of explore this further on our website, but looking at data on housing stock, on demographics and demographic shifts, and on the market, we essentially categorize neighborhoods by their risk or status of gentrification and displacement. So the purple neighborhoods are low-income households, and the lighter purple is risk of gentrification and displacement, and the darker is ongoing gentrification displacement, and we also categorize moderate and high-income neighborhoods by their risk of exclusion or whether they have ongoing exclusion, losing low-income households. So kind of without going into a lot of detail on our maps, because I'm here to talk about housing tenure today, the takeaway here is just that gentrification and displacement in the Bay Area are widespread phenomena, as I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you in this room. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So again, I don't think I need to tell any of you why displacement matters, but we did some research together with partners in Silicon Valley, in San Mateo and Santa Clara County, directly surveying displaced respondents on some of the impacts of displacement in their lives. And in San Mateo County, we found that about a third of displaced respondents were leaving the county, and on average, they were being displaced to neighborhoods with fewer resources in terms of healthcare and other things. And in Santa Clara County, we found real challenges in finding affordable housing nearby where they had previously been living. And also a lot of folks ending up in precarious housing. So I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, but also kind of making some of the precarious trade-offs that were mentioned earlier. And in Santa Clara County, we also found some of the impacts that Solange mentioned in terms of this sort of displaced respondents were less likely to take political action with community members in their new kind of destination community, as well as less likely to respond affirmatively to the question of, would you go to a neighbor for a favor for something like childcare? So we're seeing the impacts on families, and then also if we can go to the next slide, seeing impacts on racial equity at the regional scale. So we did some research this past year on rising housing costs and regional resegregation, and found that historically Black cities and neighborhoods across the Bay Area between 2000 and 2015 lost thousands of low-income Black households, and on average, we saw large increases in the number of low-income people of color living in newly segregated and high-poverty areas. So overall, people who are being pushed out by rising housing costs, low-income people of color, were moving to areas with, lower housing costs, but also fewer resources. So some of what we saw in our research in Silicon Valley, which was kind of a smaller sample doing a direct survey, was also kind of confirmed by this larger scale demographic research. So these are things that kind of, activists have been shouting for years, right? But it's kind of affirmed by a lot of what we're seeing in the data. So now that we've talked about displacement happening in the Bay Area and why it matters, I want to talk a little bit about sort of a new way of thinking about how we can assess our current housing conditions. So calling this housing tenure diversity, and essentially just the varied ways people are living. So we often talk about renters and owners, and we don't go into a lot of nuance on sort of, are you living in an overcrowded situation? What is your formal or not formal leasing arrangement? If you're renting, how many units is it? Because that has implications for what kind of legal protections you're getting, right? So if we can go to the next slide. Sorry, these got a little shifted, but so why this is important, the goal of looking at housing tenure diversity is more protected Bay Area residents. So the idea is to kind of lift up housing tenure types that protect people well, and also get real about those that don't, and think about how people could be better protected, to move towards a clear understanding of how people are living so that we can have a clearer vision about what needs to happen. So I'd like to just pause here and kind of hear more from the folks in the room about some of the different places that people you work with are living. I heard people working with health and homelessness services, and it would be good to just talk about, if you can think like as specifically as possible about different kinds of housing types that people that you work with or doing home visits with are living in. It would be great to just hear a few examples before we dive in. Yeah.
There's multiple families living in garages that are unfinished. So cement floors, no kitchen, etc. And some of them, there's a blanket hung between the families. Identify the different households.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm calling to have clients living in renting storage units.
Cars. Yeah, a lot of cars. Yeah. So utility hookups. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. And I think it's really helpful to hear that, to ground us in sort of where things are at and how bad things are for a lot of folks right now. And also, you know, kind of some of those aren't even represented here. So I'll talk a little bit about having done like a pilot version of just trying to quantify all the different tenure types by doing surveys with folks in Oakland specifically. And it's interesting, that's the first time I'm hearing about storage units, and it seems like the housing crisis every day. Perfect. There are sort of new nooks and crannies that folks are calling. So I want to talk about, so I think the reason that assessments like a housing tenure diversity assessment are really important is that our current assessments that we use for housing are usually focused on production of new housing. And we have a housing shortage in the Bay Area. We do need to produce more housing, especially affordable housing that's been disproportionately underproduced for a long time in the Bay. But the way that we typically do housing assessments looks like the regional housing needs allocation arena. So we're saying, how much does a city need to build based on its population and jobs, and then not building it, but that's another story. And in terms of how can we assess where folks are at in terms of needing specific kinds of protections and drive that from a real current state of affairs, we don't have good tools for that. And you know, people are working on tools to kind of assess what kinds of properties could be good opportunities for preservation of healthy, affordable housing, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done there too. And I just want to mention some collaborators before I move on. So this work comes out of a paper that was written on kind of looking at tenure diversity in the US by Alex Shaffrin, Jake Wegman, and Deirdre Pfeiffer, and I collaborated with Alex and Jake, as well as Steve King at Oakland Community Land Trust on the Oakland pilot. So if you're interested in digging into Oakland numbers and how we did this, there's a website, housingvulnerability.org, that you can check out. I think I wanted to start off by kind of, when we did the Oakland pilot, we came up with several sort of buckets of housing that I think help ground this work. So as I said, often we're talking about owning and renting when we typically talk about housing tenure. And really, when we sat down and did a bunch of interviews with folks, there's so many other ways that people are living. So between owning and renting, there's kind of third way housing like community land trust that sort of blend owning and renting in certain ways that I'll talk more about. Within rental, as Will mentioned, there's subsidized housing where you're receiving some kind of government subsidy, as well as unsubsidized private market housing. There's all kinds of different informal arrangements. Obviously, I think part of what this work tries to do is lift up homelessness as sort of a way that a lot of people are living right now, so that we can kind of recognize it in housing conversations better. And then also Will suggested the addition of incarceration, because that's the way that a lot of people are living as well. And I think that's a really important addition. So first, just starting with ownership, 57% of Bay Area residents are living in owner-occupied homes. So this is a really big tenure category. And there's different kinds of, you know, owner-occupied housing situations. But overall, you know, homeownership is obviously seen as a goal and kind of as the most stable tenure type, and is a really important asset building opportunity, historically the most important source of wealth in Black communities. And something we don't talk about is that homeowners or home ownership receives a lot of government subsidies. So we think about subsidized housing as being the recipient of a lot of government subsidy, but actually the largest recipient is home ownership through the mortgage interest tax deduction primarily. And another sort of boon to homeowners is that following natural disasters, homeowners are the most eligible for public assistance, and often kind of, you know, it's going to be the most accessible for them to rebuild or revitalize where they are if that's what is desired. But there's a lot of vulnerabilities. Obviously, the foreclosure crisis kind of revealed a lot of the vulnerabilities, particularly with predatory lending and subprime mortgages, especially being targeted in Black and brown communities. And then also, you know, particularly for low-income seniors, there can be challenges holding onto your home, you know, not just through predatory lending initially, but through property taxes and maintenance issues and being able to keep up with those. Moving on to subsidized rentals. To unsubsidized rentals. So renting in the private market is more than 1 in 3 Bay Area residents. And as we know, there are a lot of challenges for renters, especially in a housing crisis like this one. We've talked about housing affordability challenges. So there's, you know, eviction, there's rent hikes, which are kind of de facto eviction in many cases. And then there's also just the threat of eviction and how that's leveraged against renters to keep people living in unhealthy situations. This is compounded if you're an undocumented immigrant, of course, and there's other power dynamics at play with a landlord. And then also something we don't talk about much when we talk about renters, as I mentioned before, is that unit type matters. So I'm going to go into this, but under our state law of Costa-Hawkins, we have restrictions on how jurisdictions can implement rent controls. I'm sure many of you know, and single family rentals cannot be protected by rent control. And as I'm going to talk about, that's a growing swath of the rental market. So really lifting that up to talk about vulnerability, I think is really important post-foreclosure crisis particularly. And in a lot of places, you know, assuming there are tenant protections in the first place, which in a lot of places there aren't, owner-occupied duplexes and triplexes are often not protected. So just the takeaway kind of being that not all even formal rental situations are created equal when it relates to tenant protections. And of course, there's a range of formality in leasing and tenure when you get into stuff like SROs, hotels, even a lot of kind of backyard or accessory dwelling units, ADUs. And for renters, there just aren't those same kind of protections post-disaster or sort of same kind of assistance post-disaster. So just to do a deep dive on single family rentals, this is from a story from Mercury News on the Fetu family in East Palo Alto. Maybe some of you saw this, where they were owning their home, lost it to foreclosure, became tenants, and then ultimately were evicted. So this is like a really kind of terrible cycle that is cropping up in lots of places. And a lot of people who are foreclosed upon don't even get to stay in the house in the first place, of course, right? But as you can see, so about 40% of the area renters are living in single family rentals. So that's a lot of folks. And the share of single family homes that are renter occupied has gone up. There were a lot of single family homes that were built in the early 2000s, and you've got the foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession with more families looking to rent, as well as more families who previously were homeowners, right? So particularly Oakland, Richmond, Mountain View, and San Jose have seen a large uptick in the share of single family homes being used as rentals. And in some places, a significant share of these homes may be investor owned. In Oakland, for example, by 2011, investors had acquired 42% of all the properties that had gone through foreclosure since 2007. And with investor ownership, there's research from other places in the country about a higher threat of eviction with investor ownership. How am I doing on time, Will?
You have 15 minutes left of the session.
Yeah, so that's kind of making a distinction between mom and pop or smaller landlords and large corporations that are buying properties and property managing them. And in a lot of cases, that stat I mentioned from Oakland comes from a report that Steve King from Oakland Community Land Trust did. I think it's called Who Owns Oakland. In a lot of cases, those investor owners are living in other places. So it means that the wealth is not staying in our communities, but it's going elsewhere. There are some really interesting maps that will show kind of a community and then where all the sort of property owners, especially single family rentals, live, and they're kind of all over the place. Thanks, and please interrupt me with any questions. So I think this is just sort of a big gap in protections when it comes to, these are probably folks who are on formal leases, and yet this is a big gap in protections even in places that have tenant protections. Oh, and one more thing to mention with that, I put this up here because this is an image from the Keep Families Home kind of bill package of tenant protections, which is trying to change Costa-Hawkins to protect single-family homes, along with statewide just cause for evictions protections, which say that you can't evict somebody for any reason at all, but these are being gutted right now in the legislature. So there's clearly sort of not enough political will to get Californians better protected, despite the fact that we've got so many renters. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay. Sorry?
No, this is good.
Okay, great. So now moving on to talk about subsidized rentals. So, you know, these again are not all created equal. We've got public housing, housing choice vouchers in Section 8, low-income housing tax credits, and other forms of below market rate housing, like housing that's created through inclusionary zoning policies, as well as permanent supportive housing. And there are a lot of really great stability factors that come with subsidized housing. First of all, just affordability, right? These are rent restricted housing arrangements. And additionally, if there is a displacement situation, oftentimes replacement or relocation is kind of more baked in to the leasing arrangements than it might be on the private market, depending on the kinds of tenant protections in the jurisdiction where you are. However, there are vulnerabilities in subsidized rentals. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Section 8 or housing choice vouchers in a moment, but even just thinking about public housing, low-income housing, tax credit housing, there's really strict eligibility rules, meaning that not everybody can live here. So I actually think it might have been you, Ophelia, who chimed in on a stakeholder engagement we had about designing a study on the impact of tenant protections in Silicon Valley. Were you on the phone for that?
I was.
Yes. So your contribution kind of got me thinking about this even more, because folks were talking about naturally occurring affordable housing on the private market versus government subsidized affordable housing. And I think, you know, people were sort of saying the great thing about government subsidized affordable housing is it's like affordable longer term, depending on how long the deed is restricted. This can be a really great solution for communities that's less vulnerable to conversion to other housing types. And what you said was, yes, but it's not always available to the same people. If you've got any kind of criminal record, if you're undocumented or mixed status family, the government subsidized housing is not going to always be accessible to you in the same way. And that's something that we don't always talk about when we talk about how and what type of affordable housing we're going to be building. Additionally, you don't have control over your housing conditions. And something that really doesn't get talked about much is that evictions protections can be less clear. Typically, a jurisdiction's tenant protections don't apply to government subsidized affordable housing. And that's because why would you need rent control if you're rent restricted, for instance, right? There are good, clear reasons for that. But in terms of evictions protections, it can often be at the discretion of property managers, which can be complex. So this is not urban displacement project research. This was just me lifting up a journalism student at UC Berkeley who I thought did a really cool multimedia story on homelessness in Oakland. But just diving into housing choice vouchers a little bit, I first want to just kind of take a pause and ask, like, how in the places that you're interfacing with different government subsidized housing, particularly with housing choice vouchers, but really any kind of subsidized affordable housing, and experiences that folks in your communities have had with that, or challenges in terms of vulnerabilities, because it is a conversation that doesn't come up much. So I just wanted to hear if, you know, in Oakland, for example, housing choice vouchers often don't mean much because people aren't able to use them. We hear from a lot of homeless people that I have a voucher, right? And so I kind of wanted to just hear if you see me.
Yeah, I mean, so I work with resources. You have people who literally have everything they need to rent stuff. They have a housing voucher, Section 8, but it can even be permanent supportive housing with services attached, and they are still homeless sitting in our shelter for 6 months because they cannot find a landlord to rent to them. And the other piece I'm really glad you mentioned is the piece about incarceration. So like if we're thinking about reentering population, you know, say I have a kid who was incarcerated and is now back, and there may be restrictions, like if he comes lives with me, I could lose my housing. So then he's on the street, and how is he supposed to not? You know, like it's crazy.
Right. Yeah. There's a scholar called Rahim Kurwa who did a really, really great dissertation on sort of how Section 8 is policed by community in Antelope Valley outside of LA. And one of the stories he listed up was a mom who, her 13-year-old daughter had been caught shoplifting, and the housing authority was saying, she can't live with you anymore. And she was like, she's a teenager, what am I supposed to do with her? Like, they're like, you have to all move out. Or so.
Yeah, I was gonna say our Community Development Commission recently did some analysis on their wait lists and determined that it would be like 700 years or something before they'd be able to put people on the wait list currently. And so they had to, I don't remember all the details, but they had to kind of reimagine how people are getting on the wait list and send out letters to say, we're scrapping that, we're doing something different.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were some of the, well, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, it was, I feel like somebody from CDC should be here to
Okay,
speak to it, but it had to do with where people were coming from to apply, a number of different factors. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to hear success stories like that.
Yes, please. Sorry to ask for them.
Yeah, Karen, we're using housing choice vouchers for our homeless individuals, and we have actually more landlords willing to rent right now than we have vouchers to give
Oh,
away.
where are you?
I'm with Marin County Health and Human Services, and I work really closely with the coordinated entry team. And it's partly because we have a couple real estate professionals that are on the coordinated entry, basically payroll, going out and building those relationships and offering ways to make landlords feel comfortable.
Yeah, so I love that. This example in the top right here is about in LA, how they're incentivizing, they're providing financing and guidance for folks to build backyard units, so long as they commit to renting them to voucher holders for 5 years. So there's really interesting, and I know Oakland's been trying to innovate around ways to incentivize landlords, but relationship building I haven't heard much about, and it's really interesting. Yeah.
That just reminded me too, we've been doing more coordination across departments so that when our Community Development Commission is reaching out to folks about availability of temporary housing, we have more avenues to get a hold of people so that more people are moving into those opportunities and not losing it because they can't find them. So this is an application.
One quick
Okay.
about many of these applications are online, and as we have an increasing population, we're really taking literacy. So there's lots of folks that are really struggling. They don't even have the capability to apply.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to keep this moving now. Thank you for all the contributions. So third way housing I mentioned briefly, community land trusts. So community land trusts acquire land and maintain ownership of it permanently, with prospective homeowners entering into long-term renewable leases of the land and getting the chance to build some wealth and equity. And often the equity is limited because of this long-term ground lease, but it's still often significant. And so this can be a really stable wealth building opportunity with lots of control over housing conditions that looks a lot like home ownership in a lot of ways, and can be very stabilizing for a neighborhood in terms of establishing permanent affordability and gentrifying places especially. But, in the Bay Area, I emailed all the heads of community land trusts, and I think a couple didn't respond, but we're looking at probably like 1,000 residents of community land trust, which, depending how you look at it, could be that's a win, right? But I think there's a real challenge with scale. And I've heard Steve at Oakland Community Land Trust say, let's not frame that necessarily as an inherent challenge of the community land trust model, but let's look at the opportunity in terms of reimagining financing structures and the types of incentives that are going to different housing tenure types.
And I would just add, I think Melissa's been actually a real leader in helping us think about how do we get to scale with these. So just shout out.
Just a quick question. In Sonoma County, and I don't know if this is true in other counties, but one of the things where a lot of our housing goes to vacation rentals, and you just hadn't mentioned that, and I wondered how that impacts, if that's part of your analysis of when houses and apartments that were permanent, were long-term housing in a community all become short-term.
Yeah, we didn't, we did include in the Oakland model. I haven't mentioned it here, but it's something that I've seen more kind of scholarship coming out about recently as well, and just sort of there's such a challenge in terms of cities have been trying to get on top of those issues, but enforcement is such a huge challenge, right? And as more housing gets scooped up off of really tight, hot markets, that's obviously
changes
problematic.
the
Yeah,
cost of
yeah.
the available
Yeah,
rentals.
constraining supply right now in sort of artificial ways is obviously not what we need. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So informal housing, I really wanted to kind of talk about doubling up and overcrowding and living in nooks and crannies without formal leases, which we've started to talk about a little bit already. And so if we had more time, I'd be curious to hear about sort of what solutions are emerging around this from your different departments, but maybe that's something that we can talk a little bit more about in some of the discussion, because I think this is probably a place where you all are touching already a lot. And then I want to end with just talking about sort of the two last buckets of incarceration, homelessness, and hospitals, and just talk about, I think you all already know that these three systems are really inextricably linked. So with criminalization of homelessness, people experiencing homelessness can get pulled into the criminal justice system for sleeping in the wrong place, right, for different misdemeanors. 50,000 people a year nationwide enter homeless shelters immediately after exiting incarceration. And homelessness is extremely expensive to public systems and hospitals. I know you were going to mention the whole person care model, which I know about. But.
Yeah, I mean, just something that I know a lot of you are thinking about in your jurisdictions is specifically the homeless and hospitals side of this. And we haven't talked as much about incarceration as part of that cycle as well. But you know, there's increasingly sources of money that we can use to at least help people find housing coming out of homelessness. But at least my understanding of it is at least that like we have very little money to actually like build the housing or like make sure there are housing units for people to land in, so we can like help them find housing that doesn't exist. And I know a lot of us are working at the intersection of like these three systems. And I would also just to name like this is a personal thing for me. Like my uncle recently died, but he was schizophrenic. And he cycled between these three different things until my mom and her brother like did a lot of advocacy to be able to get him into like a subsidized supportive housing unit with mental health supports. But like that kind of resource is available to very, very few people. And I think in my case, it was like a lot to do with race and a lot to do with other things that like a lot of folks don't have access to. So I just want to like name that this is a lot of people. It's a lot of our like families and communities that are cycling in these systems. And it's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think there's a challenge for us in talking about it as something that's very costly to public systems in a way that doesn't dehumanize people too, right? It's like I think that's a task for us as public health, is to talk about like the cost savings and about like my uncle, you know, like
right.
those things together.
Right. Our housing first models get justified by the cost savings to hospitals, and that's important to talk about that, but stuff can get lost in that. Yeah.
The homeless definition.
Yeah.
There's growing populations of people living in vehicularly domiciled situations.
Yeah.
But that's growing. And I don't know, are you separating that out when we're talking about this? Because there's different solutions that would all be temporary and none of them are great.
Right.
But there's different solutions that need to be looked at as opposed to actually living on the street.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not actually linear. Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Yeah, but what was really interesting is when I was first kind of trying to quantify all this, like a year or two ago, we kind of came up with like 56 different ways of living in Oakland, right? And as I was doing the research, new sort of homeless tenure types kept emerging. Tough sheds came out during that time, right? Or cabin communities, as they're now being called. And, you know, more and more research on just how many people are living in their cars or in their RVs, right? So vehicles isn't on here, and this isn't actually linear, but I think actually really separating out each of the different ways that you can be unhoused is really sort of part of what this kind of tenure diversity analysis tries to do. Because just moving to the next slide, I think. There are so many. This is an image from a recent article about Berkeley trying to pass an RV ban, and then they said, well, wait, Oakland kind of said, well, people are just going to come over here, and they were like, wait, we need to figure this out before we just outright ban it, right? but there's a really great report that came out of Berkeley Law just on how many sort of vagrancy laws there are and how kind of policed it is to, how criminalized it is to be homeless. And that if there is nowhere for people to go, and if we don't have alternative solutions, that we kind of need to think about how people can be best protected where they are. And this isn't to sort of reify or lift up living on the street, it's just to get real about the fact that people are, right? And so if you're clearing out encampments at, you know, 4 times the rate that you're building tough sheds, what else is happening, right? And that could be a much longer conversation, but I have to wrap up. So just kind of ending with talking about incarceration, as I said, this is where a lot of people are living, and prisons are very vulnerable to weather events, including extreme heat. We saw the valley fever outbreak in the Central Valley. So there's a lot of challenges of sort of health vulnerability in terms of being in prison, and then coming out, as we've talked about, it makes it very hard to get other housing. This is some advocacy happening in Oakland. John Jones III advocating for a Ban the Box campaign, which you've probably heard about, for job applications where you have to, you know, check a box for a criminal record, and there's now a campaign to sort of remove that box for housing as well. That's cropped up in different cities. So because I have to wrap up, just want to close by saying the goal of this tenure diversity analysis is to move us toward solutions that recognize that diversity and sort of use a harm reduction approach to move away from stigmas and towards awareness of all the different ways that people are actually living, and a solution-oriented analysis. So I mentioned the 3 Ps of tenant protections, production of housing, preservation of existing affordable, healthy, resilient housing. And I think an analysis like this gives us a better baseline understanding so that we can sort of identify those gaps in protection from displacement and health risk, and identify opportunities for preservation as well. So I'll end with kind of a provocation about what is your role in public health that I'm hoping we can discuss more in the more interactive portions. But for now, I'll let Ophelia take it away about how we got here and everything. So thank you.
All right, once again, round of applause. Thank you, Anna. And I was sitting here being like, wow, this is amazing. This is like relatively new research that that Anna and others are producing. And I feel really lucky having you're the associate director, right, of folks that are like, the Urban Displacement Project is respected like around the country for like doing some of the cutting edge thinking about how people are living and how we protect them. And similarly, Ophelia joins us now from UCA in East Palo Alto, which is an environmental justice and youth-led organization. And Ophelia also brings a lot of expertise as a housing planner for the regional agency that helps set some of the housing policies at the regional level. So she brings a ton of expertise as well, also from like both the government and also advocacy and community perspective. So anyway, take it away, Ophelia.
Thank you. Y'all will have to forgive me. I have to wield my third arm. I love working in in the grassroots area, but our printer did not work today. So I'm sure it will work
in there,
you know, when I don't urgently need it. Can I grab the?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. How do I do that? Okay, that's me. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Will. And a lot of, I think my presentation will kind of weave in beautifully with Anna's, and she covered a number of points that I can kind of lightly touch now. So I'll be crisp, and then we can kind of move on to the to the discussion portion of today's agenda. So before going right into the roots of the housing crisis, I wanted to pose a question that you all probably, it sounds like already from hearing your comments and such. I wanted to pose a question to you all. How do rising housing costs affect health? We already touched on some of these, but if we can get like a couple more popcorn style comments. Okay, hearing none, I'll move on. Maybe we're all in the room. Right, you know, these are like basic questions, so I'll go. Excuse me, and I'm also like fighting a little cough, but it's going away. So, one of the ways is that you're forced to cut back on critical necessities, right? If you're living in a really expensive housing situation, whether it be a mortgage, whether you're a owner and your mortgage burdened or rent burdened, it could be that, particularly in a rental situation, if you get a rent hike, it could be that you can stay there, you somehow manage to pull, pull things together, but you're forced to cut back on food, on healthcare, whatever, childcare. Another one being that, as it was mentioned before, consolidating housing with other households. So, all of a sudden your family can't afford, you have your son and your daughter pitching in, they have, after school jobs, and all of a sudden that's still not enough. So your cousin moves in with her household, and now you're doubled up, sometimes tripled up. Another one being that you move to you can likely be forced to move to less poor quality housing. And that can mean a host of different things, whether it's housing that has mold in it or that is not weathered correctly, where you can't use heat, or I don't even have one, so I don't know, the air freshener, not the air freshener. Conditioner.
I'm from the East Coast, I got you.
But, so things that you can't use in your home when it's really cold or really hot. Having to move multiple times, it was brought up that when you have children in the home, that's a huge burden on your children. It's really hard to continue excelling in school when you're not stable, and when you're moving schools. Another one is moving to less safe neighborhoods, or farther away neighborhoods in general, where there's less social services. The quality of the housing is not as good as your previous housing condition, perhaps. And then losing housing entirely. You just don't have anywhere to go. You end up on the streets. One of the ones that didn't make it on here, surely for purposes of there not being enough space, was social cohesion, and that was also brought up in comments that I was hearing before. So sorry, I realized I asked a redundant question. We had already kind of been through this. But going into the roots of the crisis, I'll let you all take a look at this diagram, which is really helpful, but the one thing that I wanted to caveat or to add on to this is that although the magnitude of the housing crisis has reached unprecedented levels, now there has, in a way, always been a housing crisis for communities of color, low-income working families, right? Especially Black families, especially immigrant families, you name it. So we're seeing the crisis reach other populations now. But I say that to also say that it's important to honor those families that have been enduring this for a really long time, and to acknowledge that as like a sort of day-to-day resilience, right? And then looking at the other root causes, also such as like limited housing production, disinvestment and reinvestment, hinting at that this new wave of gentrification, low tenant power, which I'll go into a little bit later, and then climate change and disaster, which was also covered a little bit later on. We'll go through these fairly quickly in the next few slides.
Ophelia, I also want to urge you to take your time. I think I'm just going to move some of the discussion to our next session because I don't want to rush you.
Okay.
So I mean, certainly,
thank you.
Don't just anyway.
Break through. I'm clicking through here. No, okay, thank you. Let me see. So one quick thing that.
So with that said,
yeah.
What hasn't been brought up is the health impact of longer commute.
Yes.
Displacement. You still have to get to the same job, and the impact that has on individuals and health.
Absolutely. And to add one more little nuance to that is it has health implications for both the driver, the super commuter, as well as the pass-through communities, if you will, like GHG, the greenhouse gas emissions from their vehicle. Oftentimes, if you're a lower income family, your car is probably old. It's not in great shape. So you're, releasing smog, doing really long commutes. East Palo Alto, my hometown, has a really severe traffic problem. 90% of the traffic that comes through our city is cut-through traffic. It's not from our own residents. And we have the highest asthma rates among children in the county. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Was there a hand back there too? Or maybe, okay, thank you. So one of the things that I omitted and wanted to move forward along that I'll mention now is that people of color have been systematically excluded from opportunities through discriminatory housing, discriminatory laws and practices like racial covenants, redlining, discriminatory lending practices. And although those practices are no longer lawful, there are these legacies that we still have to contend with, right? So we are still seeing really severe disparities among homeownership, among just simply access to housing, and homelessness shows that. Racial demographic breakdown of homelessness will show you that as well. So going into one of the root causes, a booming hourglass economy, I had a much better graphic for this, and I looked for it for far too long before I realized, okay, I just have to work with this one. What you see here is a regional snapshot of the growth in jobs. The green line is low-wage jobs, and the orange line is high-wage jobs, with middle-wage jobs being this blue line that's right in the middle, like hovering a little over 20%. A couple of sub-regional highlights. This is for the entire Bay Area, but a couple things that I wanted to highlight as well is that the South Bay has seen the most growth in high-wage jobs, while the North Bay has experienced the most growth in low-wage jobs. And then looking at the root cause of limited housing production, what we're looking at here is a statewide a chart that shows statewide production of housing. And it's not even like construction of housing. I should say these are permits that were issued to construct housing. So these aren't like, this isn't a picture of housing units that were constructed and have like people living in those. These are pieces of paper that say you can build a home. So in this chart, as you all can probably tell, the crisis was a long time coming. It didn't appear overnight. The solid line at the top indicates the projected annual need in 1998, and the dashed line below shows the projected annual need in 2015. And again, this is for all of California. The solid bars indicate the number of housing permits issued by local jurisdictions, with the dark blue indicating permits for the construction of single-family homes. And the light blue portion of the bar indicates permits for the construction of multifamily homes. So apartments, condos. With the passing of Prop 13 and kind of the fiscalization of land use happening, it is often perceived, from what I hear from various jurisdictions, is that it's not profitable to build housing. In fact, it's a cost. You have to, anticipate that there will be more children in your schools, perhaps. You have to anticipate the increased need for social services, perhaps. And it doesn't bring in, it's not an economic engine for cities, right? So that's some of the sentiment that I hear from folks at the local jurisdiction level. And I believe a future topic, like Will mentioned, will go into more depth about this particular.
Sorry,
okay.
This is for both subsidized and market rate housing. That's right. Yes. Okay. Yes,
it is. So that's actually a good question to come into this segue, which doesn't exactly pull apart subsidized and unsubsidized housing, but it does show you the level of income at which these housing units are being permitted in the Bay Area. So the previous graph was just for the entire state of California. This is just for the Bay Area. What you're looking at here is, how many housing permits were issued in 2014, 2015, 16, and 17. So this, it's blue on my laptop, but this kind of grayish, dark purple hue is the amount of above moderate housing that was built, or housing for above moderate incomes. The tiny little lines down here in order are very low, low, and moderate. So this much is being built for very low to moderate households, and this much is being built for above moderate.
What's the threshold for the above moderate?
Like income threshold? For the Bay Area, let's see, because we do it by we collect these. I'm a former, as Will mentioned, I'm a former housing planner at ADAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, which collects this data. It varies by county. Different counties have different AMIs. So yeah, I'm not quite sure if there's like a uniform one for the Bay Area, but yeah.
Just is above moderate like above AMI, or is above moderate like above a certain percentage above AMI?
Yeah, no, it's above the moderate income.
I think you know.
which is 80 to 120% AMI, right?
Yes, that's right.
80 to 120, yeah.
Percent of the area median income.
So in Alameda County, that's like around, all that gray area is built for households, I think, over $115,000.
In San Mateo, it's over 100,000.
You were saying that, housing development is not profitable, and I just want to clarify that this data suggests then that it is profitable if you're building it for, well, above moderate.
Absolutely.
This is still affordable housing. All of these gray units, even if it's above moderate, it's still
Oh no. I mean, if you're at well over 100K salary, maybe it's affordable to you. But
I think it would be considered affordable housing and might be part of an inclusionary housing production.
No, the gray area, the above moderate is not considered affordable, and like it's not. So the state kind of prescribes this number, not exactly prescribes, comes up with all these formulas to give each jurisdiction a number of housing that they need to build at each level. So very low income, moderate, and above moderate. And there's like certain thresholds for each of those. The above moderate ones are not affordable, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they don't get any government subsidy.
They don't get any government subsidy. They're all privately built. Generally speaking, they're private. Yeah.
Private money.
Mentioned earlier, they actually get the bulk of government.
Yeah, right. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, reframing that.
But I think, but in terms of the people who are building the housing, right, it's profitable to the people who are building this housing because they're able to sell it and make money out of doing it.
Right. Like your comment before was more about profitability for cities. Yeah.
For cities.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
And is a certain percentage has to be below market rate? They have to rent out a certain amount of the newer buildings. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think you're talking about an inclusionary housing ordinance. So
I don't know. My understanding is below market rate. Like whenever they build a new apartment building, there's supposed to be some units that they have to rent out below market rate.
yeah, that's it. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, like below market rate and inclusionary housing, or kind of in a sense. So I think what you're describing is when there's a new housing project being built, and it's all market rate, or most of it is market rate. Some cities have this policy where they say, hey, 15% of that housing has to be affordable, and those are the below market rate units.
Even the below market rates aren't affordable. Yeah.
And not all cities have those policies. Yeah.
Yeah, and then not very many cities have these policies. Some might, some have 10%. We in East Palo Alto are pushing for 20%, and even that is like, okay.
Just to bring that back, that's what I meant. So some of these above moderate may be part of the BMR unit.
Got it. I see what you mean. They would be in the same complex. They could be in the same complex. Sometimes they're built off site, not to go too deeply into it, but they would be in the same housing complex at an affordable level. So they would be like below market rate units. They wouldn't be included in the above market rate units.
Yeah, but this above moderate could be included in those. Those units that are provided.
Yes, if your city happens to have like an inclusionary housing below market rate program or policy. Yes.
And can I add, not to make this overly complicated, and Ophelia will turn to like solutions at the end of her presentation, so we'll get into a little bit of those policies. But I would just say, increasingly, we're seeing a lot of political support for policies that are about like moderate income people, so like the missing middle or workforce housing. A lot of our jurisdictions are starting to say, oh, we really need to prioritize that type of housing and subsidize it. And, I think at BARHII, we're in constant kind of back and forth about like, yes, that's really important. And also it's really important to be subsidizing housing that like is literally the difference between someone being homeless or not.
Yeah. Thank you. And I will, I think inclusionary housing might not have made it, but is one of like of the solutions toward the end that we talk about that some cities have begun to implement, or East Palo Alto is revisiting inclusionary stuff. So I have a really, excuse me, a really short timeline, not even timeline, just bullet points. And you might know this history. It could be just a refresher. But hinting back, or not even hinting, directly talking back to those lawful discriminatory practices that this country used to have and that we still are seeing the legacy of, really quickly wanted to highlight that in 1917, the Supreme Court did deem city segregation ordinances, I have illegal, but they were legal. Racial restrictive covenants became popular. So that's a big part of how East Palo Alto, my hometown, was created. Folks were applying to, Black families in particular, were applying for mortgages in beautiful single-family homes that they could afford, that they had the credit for. In Palo Alto, they were kind of shepherded toward East Palo. So like you should stay within these bounds. 1934, the redlining process is introduced by the Federal Housing Administration. And redlining is basically the practice of denying or limiting financial services to neighborhoods based on racial or ethnic composition without regard for the residents' qualifications or creditworthiness. So those two definitions are a little different, but they definitely go hand in hand. And then last year, we saw the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which is really interesting because considering that it's been 50 years, I'm not sure how far we've come. In fact, as I was putting this presentation together, I was just going through, refreshing my mind on some of the articles that I had recently read, and there are a number of articles saying the Bay Area is more segregated now than we were previously.
The Haas Institute released a report on that like yesterday. Yeah,
oh, okay.
Recommend.
Read that.
Haas at Berkeley, HAAS.
Mm-hmm. And then speaking of UC Berkeley, here's a map of the Bay Area. Anna already pointed out the Urban Displacement Project website. But what you're basically looking at here is, again, you're looking at the ripple effects of those legacies of unjust housing policies that existed before, and then all of a sudden we're experiencing a booming economy and enter stage gentrification. To define the term really quickly, generally, gentrification refers to the process by which low-income families and individuals are displaced by more affluent residents and businesses, and in the process of renovating a deteriorated or quote-unquote blighted neighborhood. That displacement part is really crucial to the definition. You might hear some folks say, hey, gentrification is a good thing, right? We're renovating the neighborhood. We're bringing capital into somewhere where it didn't exist before. And yes, but at what cost? At what, what's the human toll of that? So those two parts of that definition you can't pull those apart. If you're developing equitably and making sure that folks can stay in their homes and establishing policies that don't displace families, then maybe that's not gentrification. That's like equitable community development, right? But gentrification is, a really important part of that definition is that displacement and pushing out low-income families who can no longer afford to live there. To give you a little more detail about what you're looking at here on this map is, so the lavender shades point out lower income tracts at different stages of gentrification. The darker the purple or the lavender, the more advanced the gentrification. And then the orange is the same, but for moderate income tracts. The lavender is descriptive of lower income families or lower income tracts. So now, remember that in recent years with the economic boom, the Bay Area has seen immense growth and investment, right? Oh, the shading didn't make it on here. Interesting, okay.
Was it from our website? Or
maybe. There it is.
Yeah, okay.
So again, pointing or referring back to the redlining practices by the FHA, what the red kind of geographies that you see on this map, that you see here on this map of Oakland, is where places that were deemed really risky to issue mortgages for home buyers. I think they were classified by, green is the best one, so the hills, and then blue, then yellow, and then red, which is the worst. So if you look at this purplish, bluish overlay, will remind me what
This is the priority development areas, like where the region wants to prioritize
Oh,
development?
that's right, that's right. So this is kind of almost perfectly overlapping with areas geographies that were previously disinvested in and are now seeing a new wave of investment, right? So what does that mean for families? How are they experiencing this, particularly in Oakland? I think you all have kind of begun to share those thoughts in Anna's presentation. So going back to one of the second to last root cause, low tenant power. Even at the height of homeownership, at the kind of artificial bubble, if you will, in the 07, 08 years, people of color weren't, never owned homes at more than, I think, a 30-ish% rate. And the peak overall was almost at 70, like 69-ish% of folks were owning homes. And that goes to show that tenant protection, tenant rights have always been super important, and even more so now that homeownership is dwindling across the board, not just for families of color, but also for everyone else, for white families. Homeownership is dwindling. Keep in mind that recent college graduates who perhaps could have bought a home at a different time period with their college degree, with a fairly new salary, we're not able to do that anymore. So we're in the wrong era, but here we are. The other part of this is that the preemption of rent control through Costa-Hawkins, which Anna talked a little bit about, has made the California political landscape pretty hostile toward rent stabilization measures. So like Anna mentioned, single family homes aren't covered by rent protections, and even the multifamily homes, apartments that are covered, the ones that are covered are the ones that were built prior to 1995 when Costa-Hawkins was established. And there's still this thing called vacancy decontrol that even if you're living in a rent stabilized unit, when you move out, the rent is hiked up to market rate. So the next person comes in and they're rent controlled at that new market rate price. So if you think about it in a long-term game or in a long-term sense, these units, it's great that they're rent controlled for now, but they're slowly kind of phasing out of actual or true affordability. Let's see, I covered that. Do any of y'all have friends, even family members or patients especially, who have shared that they've been evicted, or everyone? I'm hard pressed these days to find anyone who doesn't know. So that was kind of just a point for affirmation. Evictions have gripped so many communities in the Bay Area, and families are experiencing a host of problems because of this, right? Stress was brought up. So not only for the parents, but for children who are having to leave schools, move from school district to school district. And the unfortunate part is that landlords have an incentive to evict people because of the growing potential for rental profits. So again, to your point, why would I continue to own this dilapidated apartment complex when I could renovate it and kick out all my tenants first, renovate it, and turn them into condos perhaps, and get much more return than what I'm getting now. That's a pretty big and unfortunate incentive that folks are having to contend with law on the ground. And just to put a kind of the term to that that's called the rent gap. The growing potential for rental profits in buildings with low rents and increasing property values, alongside a pool of wage earners who are willing to pay higher rents. So in short, the rent gap represents that incentive for eviction of low wage earners in order to tap into the rental profits of high wage residents. If you remember back to the slide of what kind of jobs or what job sectors are growing, it's those low wage and high job sectors, right? So that puts us in direct competition. Who's gonna win? Not the low wage earners. So another root cause of the housing crisis as it is now is climate change and natural disasters. And the thing about this is that climate change is often framed as this thing of the future. We have, which is kind of, that horizon is getting shorter and shorter. Each time I read a new article, we have 50 years, now we have 30, now we have, no, really, we have to get it together in 10. which is really scary, but reality for a lot of people is that they're already living the realities and the kind of harsh circumstances of climate change today, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So that could be anything from families who are living in substandard housing conditions, who are living in neighborhoods that are vulnerable to sea level rise, to flooding. Their house will flood a foot, maybe the water recedes, and now you have mold all over your home, respiratory problems. You have potentially 2 families living in your house, so communicable diseases are being shared or can go around more easily. In my hometown of East Palo Alto, we have a lot of neighborhoods, single-family home neighborhoods that are really vulnerable to flooding, and these are exactly the kind of problems that we see.
We've seen a lot in San Francisco is there's a huge inequity around who has access to cooling and who doesn't have access to cooling, where it's based a lot on how new the home is, because they didn't build homes with cooling, either AC or like natural cooling before, because they didn't think they were going to need it here. And so it's like older homes, less taken care of homes don't have anything for extreme heat events, which you're kind of.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that kind of is a good segue as well. I'll raise my hand that my home doesn't have AC, which is why I had trouble naming it. I'm like, what do you call the things that keep me cool? But yeah, so in the North Bay, it gets really hot, right? It gets really hot, it gets really cold. God forbid there's like, the smallest like ember, because winds will pick up, create a fire, and we have a tragic situation like recently. And again, Anna touched on this, so I won't dwell on it too long, but folks were being rent gouged, were having the landlords move into the homes where they previously, where they were living, or their home is just completely gone. So again, framing that climate change conversation in today, like grounding it in today, is really real for the folks that you're probably seeing that we'll continue to see coming with respiratory problems, high asthma rates because of commuting, or because you're living in the neighborhood or community that is a pass-through community, and then the stress of just simply being in a 2-hour commute in a car for 2 hours.
Ophelia is going to now take us through, sorry, we're having a technical issue with the presentation. But she's going to, we've been in a little bit of a depressing mode, I would say, thus far, of like, oh my God, we're in a crisis, right? And our communications people have been telling us we shouldn't say crisis because it just makes people bury their heads in the sand. I still use it because I think we need to be real about just how dire the situation is, but we don't want to sit there. We want to move towards the, like, there are solutions, like actually, like we have a lot of research now about what can be done about it, and Ophelia is going to take us through that.
Yeah. So I skipped over a couple slides, and thank you all so much. I overheard like a couple of really great comments, so I know y'all are having great conversations. I skipped over just a couple of slides, and we'll dive right into solutions framework. So there is so much I won't get to cover today, but there is, rest assured that there are some great blueprints in our hands for implementing solutions, and particularly at the intersection that you're working in for health and housing. This, much of what I pulled from here is from changelabsolutions.org. There's a policy toolkit that is designed specifically for public health practitioners, the public health sector, and covers a gamut of solutions, funding strategies. Some really innovative things are covered in that toolkit, and I really enjoyed reading it. I had read it before, but just reading it one more time before coming here was really helpful. Diving right into this, if you think back to the chart I showed you that illustrated the housing permits issued in the Bay Area, it may have become painfully clear that the production strategy alone has not and will not address the housing crisis. So not enough affordable housing is being built at low to moderate levels, and while some may contend that by building a whole lot of housing, it will free up housing for folks who don't have it now, we have to acknowledge that that filtering or trickling down of housing, if you will, takes generations. And we have people who need housing yesterday, last week, last month, right? So we just can't wait generations. It's important to take a much more comprehensive approach where solutions complement each other and address the needs of all sectors of our community. So this 3Ps approach has been gaining a lot of popularity recently at the regional level, at the state level. We have a governor now who is talking about tenant protections. That's a great thing and extremely validating to the folks and practitioners who have been advocating for tenant protections for a while now. At the regional level, I know that there are many mixed emotions about some of the region's housing efforts, but despite all its flaws, it did also bring together this kind of 3Ps approach of presenting a housing framework that calls for the preservation of housing units, the protection of the residents living in those housing units, and the expansion slash production, hence the 3Ps, the production of more housing, both at affordable levels, at various affordable levels, and market rate as well, of course. So the other point I wanted to make in regards to the 3Ps framework is that I have been hearing increasingly from folks on the ground that the sequence of the implementation for these 3Ps matter. So I say that to say that protections is often brought up as the most necessary and immediate and cost-effective thing that we can do the fastest. We'll get into this a bit more as we go along, but for years, many housing advocates have been emphasizing that doing no harm first, making sure that people are not losing their housing if they're already in one, is one of the big priorities, if not the most important priorities before developing housing. One of the reasons why another reason why the sequence is important is because a lot of folks have experienced being priced out by the building of market rate housing. So, you know, that's ironic, right? We're building more market rate housing, and that is resulting in pushing some folks out of their communities. That right there is a dynamic tension that could be addressed if your city has really strong tenant protection policies, if you have tenant protection and tenant rights programs where tenants know their rights, know that they need to be issued a letter with a good cause for eviction if they are to leave, things of that nature. So we went into this a little bit, but to tell you a little bit more about the toolkit from which I pulled a lot of this information from, it had 3 case studies there. In the early 2000s, 3 institutions around the country began a series of experiments based on the belief that housing was fundamentally tied to health and well-being of families and the communities they serve. 2 of those institutions were public health agencies, one of which is the Alameda County Public Health Department. Do y'all have folks here? What? Hey, go Alameda. Here in our very own region, Alameda County Public Health Department began analyzing epidemiological data that would become life and death from unnatural causes, a seminal study linking social inequities to health disparities, and West Baltimore's only safety net hospital began buying and rehabilitating row houses and began rehabilitating row houses to stabilize their surrounding neighborhood, ultimately creating over 800 housing units for seniors, disabled people, and families in general. So all of this to say that public health departments have rightfully been connecting the dots for a while now. So you are all in a unique position to potentially knit together investment, community leadership, leverage some of the substantial resources that hospitals have to improve both housing policies and health outcomes. Like, this is an issue of public health. There's a lot of power in that. To breeze through a little bit of the protection or potential example protection policies, I have down here a couple examples. So just cause eviction policies, rent stabilization. I intended to go a little bit, describe a little bit what each one of these is, but for the purposes of getting through the rest of them, I'll let you glance through the slide, what the intent of protection policies are, protecting residents, again, like I mentioned, from displacement via rising rents, or helping them relocate as like a last, when all else fails, helping them relocate to a new unit if necessary.
And Ophelia, just to take the pressure off a little bit, we were trying to do like kind of a scan of some of the policies today, and then our third session we're going to do a much deeper dive. So
awesome.
You don't have to like jot them down like, intensely, we just wanted to make sure you knew, like, there's things we can do about this, and we're going to talk about them.
Yes.
Natalia's giving us the
Oh, great. So I'll kind of just touch lightly on these. For the preservation, whereas protection policies, like I mentioned, are meant to protect the people or are more people focused, these preservation policies tend to be aimed at preserving the affordability of units, and oftentimes also are aimed at improving the units. So again, turning these substandard housing units into habitable, healthy units for people to live in. So again, a couple examples, you'll go into more depth around preservation policies in the near future. And then finally, production / expansion policies. So policies under this category typically help facilitate the construction of more housing. So that means both affordable and market rate. Some of these can be making it easier to build an ADU in your backyard. You can have, your cousin living there instead of having 2 families doubled up in a single family home. Streamline permitting processes, meaning that the applications to construct a housing unit go through faster at the jurisdictions or at the planning department in these jurisdictions. Reduce fees or waivers for affordable housing developers. Inclusionary housing ordinances, which we talked a little bit about. And I totally breezed through it, but I do have 5 minutes left, and I know you need a couple, and I had a slide for questions, but I think we had a lively discussion. So thank you all so much.
We can have just like a couple of minutes if people have questions for either Angela or Ophelia. Now's the time.
You can also reach out by email too, which I'll absolutely about. But yeah, I just want to offer that up.
Will we talk about the tension between nonprofit housing developers and particularly environmental justice communities, and the fact that they are constantly pushing for reduced oversight on the condition of the property, of the land they're going to build on, and accuse folks in those neighborhoods who say you shouldn't be building there because we know the history of that land, and why on earth are we continuing to allow new housing being built for poor people on contaminated land? I don't know if we should get into that, but
we were planning in this whole session to get deep into that. I would say, so, Ophelia talked about 3 Ps. We've actually been talking about 5 Ps for a while as public health, one of which is placement. And it really is that question. And there's a lot of really ugly tensions and like difficult things of trying to figure out, like when, like the cheap land is by freeways, it's by environmentally contaminated sites, right? And so I would just say you've named like one of the central contradictions in this work. And we may have some time, like one of our kind of co-sponsors, so actually suggested we get into that kind of question. So we may build that in as we go forward. We have like 2 minutes for questions.
I want to do this question I'd like to explore, but I'll focus on the small question, which is you talked about the limits in access to public housing for mixed status families. And I just want to clarify if this is a current risk with the changes, the HUD proposal that's out there, the change in the limits and access to public housing for mixed status families. Is that a new thing, or is that a new problem?
Yeah, so well, with the new legislation, it's kind of certainly a problem. In terms of whether it's been a problem in the past, I actually don't know as much about that. I don't know if anyone in the room does.
I don't know for subsidized housing. I know in general it's a huge problem. Like the intersection of documentation status and housing is a huge one. So BARHII's policy committee actually 2 years ago, I think, worked on a bill to make it illegal to discriminate for your tenants or threaten immigration, because that was actually happening a lot. We heard a lot, especially in the South Bay, but I'm sure it was everywhere. Of people using threats of kind of exposing people's documentation status.
And I think that can happen with low-income housing tax credit housing that's managed by different kinds of developers, right? So they're often the ones actually doing the screening. So I've kind of heard that it can really vary. That's probably more so, historically, you know, until this kind of recent HUD legislation, that's probably more so the case for a family that's completely undocumented. I hadn't heard as much about challenges for mixed status families. Yeah.
So HUD is proposing that if there are families where there's mixed immigration status, say one parent is documented and the other first adult in the family is not documented, that they would not be eligible for public housing, period, or subsidized housing, so through Section 8 or permanent source housing, which obviously would have a huge impact because there's a lot of families where that's the case. And I imagine it also extends to children. So yeah, it would have a big impact.
Yeah.
So it's not final, it's proposed, and they are taking public comment,
Yeah.
so be annoying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Michael, last thing, and then I got to close.
Yeah, well, actually, just two quick comments. When we were talking before about the public health impacts of homelessness, just an observation. One thing I've seen, mostly in Oakland on my way home, is a couple of different cars that have been essentially converted to homeless encampments. There's a loss of recreational opportunities for communities because of these places people have nowhere else to go. Is an impact, and I think that's something to consider.
Right.
And then the other thing, just a comment as we move forward as health department, one of the things that I found in my work is that landlord reluctance to get involved in innovative programs have been an impediment to helping renters.
Yeah.
And so I think it's incumbent upon us as health departments to try to understand the perspective of landlords and what it is that they feel is keeping them from participating. I don't know so much about corporate landlords, but at least what we're calling the mom and pop landlords, I think it's important to try to understand that as we move forward, because they're going to be the gatekeepers to us being able to do some important work with tenants.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so I'm going to close this out.